I think we're ready to begin. Thanks so much for taking your seats and keeping it going. I'm not going to attempt to distill what we're experiencing here today with our experience of the two popes. But I hope there's not going to be any of this Ravenna business happening soon. But anyway, or Avignon, excuse me. We reached the last waltz, anybody, of our comp? Thank you very much, thank you. I'll be here all week. And then we're off to Mass, everybody, and that's going to be wonderful. So, reminding you that you can see who our panel is by this QR code, and just kind of go in there. Every panel here, we can all agree, has been so nourishing and beautiful and exquisite and singular and irreducible. And we have another one coming your way with these 5 great writers, all wonderful talents and uniquely gifted. So we'll do a kind of reverse alphabetical order, which omega betable? No, that's not going to. But it's Alice McDermott to Phil Cly to Liam Callanan to Randy Boyagoda, Paradise at Last, Randy? Yes? And then to Christopher Beha. And so it's the North American panel, Global Aesthetics through the lens of those from North America. We have our Canadian friend Randy, and the rest are the lower 48. And I'm thinking of Annalisa, the stat about 40% of the world's Catholics are in Africa, or will be very soon. I just remember this stat because it's an outsized thing, and maybe. North Americans are 6% of the world's Catholics. And I think we're agnostic about how not in the middle of the sphere of influence we are. It's something to think about. So our panel, we're gonna really look for energy and dynamism. It's not going to be difficult with this group. And how it's going to go is each person will read and frame a personal piece of published work or new work, which is new work is just all the work is good, but you get some new work. It always warms my heart. 8 minutes each, the author, the writer, will frame their own piece. We'll have 4 minutes after. I might ask a pointed question, and then our panelists will engage one another on the person's reading. So we keep it dynamic that way, and if we keep on time properly, we'll leave about 15 minutes for your participation. So I always say, write a question down if you have it, so we're ready to kind of go. Keep it popping, keep it dynamic, especially after this part of our conference. But I feel the spirit in the room, and with that, without further ado, I will introduce Alice McDermott. Alice, welcome to our panel, and thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, all of you, for hanging in there. To be between Martin Scorsese and Mass. And then you throw math at us. I'm going to read from a new, soon-to-be-published novel. Actually, it doesn't feel like soon. It feels like a very, very long time. It will be November, so I don't have to panic yet. This is just a brief scene. The 1963 Saigon, some corporate wives, some military wives, do-gooders is how they describe themselves, are bringing baskets of small gifts to a children's ward in Saigon. That's pretty much all you need to know. She was wailing when we came into the ward that morning, a child who had not been there the week before. The sound of a child wailing was not unusual. Someone was always bawling, but her cry was sustained and unwavering, almost adult. My father would have said she was wailing like a banshee. The poor girl was halfway down the row of beds on the side of the room I was attending to, standing in a crib that was too small for her. From the moment I began my rounds, bed after bed, I was aware of how I was slowly approaching her, moving toward that unrelenting cry of distress, misery, pain. In truth, I was dreading the approach. I'm sure I even lingered a bit longer with the children and the grandparents as they chose their little gifts, shouting my bright bonjours and mercies and your welcomes in tortured Vietnamese, com, pa, yeah, over the little girl's terrible, sustained keening, wanting, in all honesty, to pass her by. But there was nothing to be done. Soon, she was my next patient. She wore only a small shirt that barely covered her taut belly. Her size made her nakedness all the more difficult to see. The slim hip and thigh, not quite adolescent, but not mitigated either by a toddler's plumpness. The folded bud of her bare privates. The sweet tenderness of her undamaged skin. Her backside and the back of her legs bore most of the burn, which was not new, but perhaps only just beginning to heal, bordered as it was with the spotted yellowish scar tissue that seemed to illustrate the moment of contact with the heat. The moment the flesh was melted away. I'm thinking here of the cinematic image of a match lighting celluloid. Terrible to consider. Her hair was cut raggedly short. There were also burns on the back of her neck. She was standing up, gripping the metal railing, her mouth open, her dark eyes, which she immediately turned on me without any change in the pitch and volume of her voice, were terrified. There is no other word. Although she had been crying since we'd arrived on the ward, no one had come to attend to her, so I knew this must have been going on for some time, this terrible lament. I knew it must have been her steady state. I gathered that everyone in the ward had somehow come to the understanding that she was inconsolable. I showed her the basket on my arm. Her eyes went to the array and then back to me with no change in the fear and the outrage they contained. Still, she wailed. I ran a hand over the gifts, lifted a teddy bear, made it dance before her, then a small, soft baby doll in a pretty pink dress, a bar of chocolate, a Pez dispenser with the head of a clown. Unrelenting, even as her eyes went to each item and then went right back to me. She was tall enough that the bar of the crib came to just below her waist. Another child could have climbed out easily, but there was no sense. It seemed there was no possibility that she would ever change this stance. She would be here endlessly, clutching that bar, turning her terrified eyes on the world, giving wordless voice to her outrage and her pain. I lowered the basket to the floor and took her in my arms. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alice. I'm going to just lead off with a pointed question, and I would encourage our panel to follow up how they'd like. So it's almost like a principle here where it's almost Thomistic, but I don't want to be too jargony about letting the art will be the art. And so we can kind of knead the matter, and I'm sure the spirit will come through. But the first thing is that the art and the craft, it compels us. So I noticed, Alice, that you have such depth. This is your ninth novel, is that right?
Yep.
Absolution. Congratulations. It's quite a career, and we've been fed by your wonderful work for years now. So your skills at characterization are profound and deft. So how do you, when you just gave us there's so much more in the book. We have almost a fully rounded character in a short space. Mm-hmm. So how do you kind of go about that? I know these are sentences, but how do you think about that when you're kind of in your writer's studio or office or in the zone?
Thank you. I've been thinking so much about this in the 6 months we've all been here together. Because there's been so much conversation about the Catholic imagination and the Catholic way of seeing. And it seems to me there's two things that I think I'm just starting to realize about the Catholic imagination in our time together here. And of course, part of it is to see, but then to see again, and again. And the insistence on, you haven't seen it enough, see it again, seems to me to parallel the contrariness of the Catholic imagination. When you're called a Catholic or labeled or sent to the Catholic writer ghetto, it's always because dogma comes first with you, obviously, and everything is settled, and now you're just going to write stories that will just show the other people, the rest of the world, how you have all the answers. But listening these past couple of days, it just occurred to me, we are contrarians, we Catholic writers, because Catholics are contrarians. We look at the world and we say, no, it doesn't end. There's hope, there's redemption. Of course there's suffering, but look at it again. Of course there are horrible characters and terrible things happen to us, but look at it again. When my oldest son was starting at Boston College, a wonderful priest there who just passed away last year, Michael Himes, gave the talk to the parents before we left our freshmen forever and ever, and he made the point that if you should fly over any Catholic university, the sound that should be coming up from the buildings and from the greens and from the classrooms is yes, but. And there, I've been thinking about that so much, that contrariness that we have, that we see the world, see it again. We haven't seen it enough. And isn't that exactly what craft is about? And Martin Scorsese was taught, even filmmakers, who knew? Do it again, fail, but do it again, see it again, write it again, until the character, character, but it's also setting, it's also story, until the character reveals itself to you and to your reader in a way that we haven't seen them before, and with an authenticity that can only be reached when you insist on look again, look again. It's not enough. What you see is not enough. Keep looking. How annoying we must be to the rest of the world, but it is that contrast. So that's how you reach character. What about this guy? What about that guy? See it again. Don't accept what we all suspect is the surface. See it again. So I think that's it.
Panel, any follow-up?
Yeah. The thing that brought to mind, I once wrote an essay, a speech about children that had seen grievously injured in Iraq and children who had died. And an Afghan veteran stood up and he said, after I came back from Afghanistan, I stopped believing in God because it made it easier. It meant there were questions I didn't have to ask. And as I listened to that piece, I was thinking about the Catholic notion of cyclical time and what that means when it's applied to suffering. And there's a memoir, Naples 44, in Italy, it feels appropriate, where the author sees these blind orphan children howling and begging, and no one is helping them. They're just eating in a restaurant. He says they're always in the dark. There will always be screaming. Mm-hmm. But in that, the character, seeing that endless cycle, also sees the potential to intervene, which seems related to what you were just talking about. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It was very moving to me. Thank you.
Small one.
I would just say, am I on? Okay. Apropos of that, I have had the opportunity to read all of this novel as it happens, and it's a really spectacular novel. I think it's one of Alice's very best, and that says quite a lot. So you all have something to look forward to. But of course, without spoiling anything, this child does not appear later on in the novel. There isn't a sense that then we find on the earthly realm this suffering being transcended in some way, or there's some further meaning of it. So it really, the meaning of it in that sense does come from this character's looking, you know, and these other women who've gone to the hospital who feel a very strong urge to do good in the world and this place they're in have this very hard time looking at this, in part because it's not something that they can make better. They can't put a smile on this child's face with the gift basket they've brought. And I think when you say the task is to look, you know, one of the things that we need to be looking at is suffering, and doing so often very much in the knowledge that it's not suffering we can fix, that we can do anything about, and suffering that you know, you say the contrarianism. Part of the contrarianism is looking at parts of the world that we have a hard time understanding how they fit in with our view of all of us being the product of the creation of a loving God, and looking that way and not flinching from that. So it's a challenge for everybody. But it's you know, it's a challenge for those of us who do believe that, to do that looking, I think, for sure.
Thanks again, Alice. And ladies and gentlemen, Phil Cly.
I'm going to stand up here just because it feels better. And this is like, I'm foolish and giving you stuff that's really new and messy, so forgive me. It's from a novel I'm working on related to my family history. My maternal grandfather was a career diplomat, and it starts in Norway. Oil, by God. And Norway had it, oceans of it lying beneath the North Sea. And by God, we needed them to pump it, drill it, and pump it. Don't you know there's an embargo on? Don't you know there's our economy and our wars to fuel? Don't you know, poor little Norway, with your fathers who faced poverty and your grandfathers who faced bare subsistence, that the more you pump, the more we'll buy? That, roughly, was the message that my grandfather, a diplomat, was meant to deliver diplomatically in 1973. What the Norwegian foreign minister told my grandfather in return was a story, a window, perhaps, into the Norwegian soul. It was about a northern town, a poor fishing village, whipped by Arctic winds, where the men cast into frigid waters while the women wrest a few crops up from unforgiving earth. Walk through the town, you'll see skin pocked by saltwater boils, lips cracked by cold, strong arms, stooped gaits, hard eyes. You know the type. Yet when the boats come in, the people gather at the local tavern. There they would drink ale such as kings for all their wealth could not buy, such as emperors for all their power could not possess. How to describe it? Talk to 10 men and 20 women, you get 30 different answers. Taste of juniper, honey, salt, dry ginger, sweet paprika. Was it strong and bitter to brace you for brave winds and killing waves, or sweet and gentle, lulling you into a haze, draping the harshness of your life with soft fabrics, transmuting your fear into calm and your pain into laughter? One thing is sure, those who gathered together and drank and shared their sorrows and laughters achieved every night fellowship. And in that tavern worked a hearty young lad, serving ale and listening to tales of joy and sorrow. He knew he lived in a blessed place, yet still he longed to see the world. So after a cold and dark winter where the sun didn't rise and set so much as shallowly bounce up and down the rim of the horizon, he asked for his wages in beer, and laden with a keg, set out on the road to seek his fate. For miles the path stretched empty before him, and though he soon grew parched, he kept on, for the ale he carried only brought joy when shared with others. Then down the road came a tall fellow, old and stern of face, with a huge beard, announcing his passage like a herald. "Good day," said the man, in a voice like the sky clearing and the sunlight shining through. "Good day to you," said the lad. "Whither away?" said the man. "This keg lies heavy on my shoulder, and I'm looking after someone to drink with and lighten the load," said the lad. "Can't you drink with me as well as with anyone else?" said the man. "Well, why shouldn't I?" said the lad. "But tell me, whence do you come, and what sort of man are you?" "I am our Lord God, and come from heaven," said the man, "our Lord God, who makes such distinction between persons here in the world and sharest right so unevenly that some get so rich and some get so poor. No, with thee I will not drink." And on he walked, the keg growing heavier on the shoulder, until up on the horizon scampered a small, scrawny man, ugly as sin, quick of movement, frantic, unsteady with the energy of the crazed or unhappily drunk. Once again, the lad and the stranger exchanged a "good day" and a "whither away" and a "can't you drink with me?" And again the lad asked, "What sort of man are you?" "Who am I?" said the little man with wounded pride. "I am the devil, and I come from hell." "That's where I come from?" "No," said the lad, "thou only pinest and plaguest poor folk. Thee I will not drink with." And on the lad walked, and the keg grew heavier, and who should appear but a tall fellow in dapper dress, but so dry and lean his bones barely hang together. And once again, there were the good days and the whither-aways, and "what sort of man are you?" "They call me Death," said the man. "The very man for my money," said the lad. "Thou art an honest, trustworthy man, for thou treatest all alike. Rich and poor, thee I am glad to drink with." And so they toasted each other's health, Death and the lad, and they drank, and the ale tasted like naught else that had ever passed the lips of man or spirit. To Death it brought color to his face, a twinkle to his eyes, and to the lad it was like the last star at morning winking out in the light of the devouring sun, like an icy whirlpool dragging him through deeps of darkness until he sat at the bottom of the sea, deaf, dumb, all human loves and cares far above him, while here below his mind burned to a single point of light. And more they drank, and the keg lightened, and more they drank, and the lad felt warmly toward Death, who had brought out this sharpness in the ale. And Death felt warmly toward the lad who had brought out this life in him. And at last Death said, "I have never known drink which smacked better. I scarce know what to give you in return." But he thought a while and said, "The keg should never get empty, and the ale become a healing drink. If ever you come to the room of the sick, I shall show myself to you. If I stand at the foot of the bed, you may cure the sick with the ale. But if I sit by the pillow, there is no healing or medicine, for they belong to me." Well, the lad grew famous as a doctor, and he helped many, growing wealthy all the while. And when he came in and he saw how Death sat by the bed, he foretold life or death, and was never wrong. But then the king himself called the lad to the bedroom of his daughter, who was sorely ill, and never woke but turned and moaned, her brow full of sweat and her face as lovely as a setting sun, and he said he must cure her. And the lad saw Death at the pillow, and he told the king there was naught to be done, neither healing nor medicine. Perhaps pray for her soul in hope of the world to come. But these are dry words to offer a king. And the king threw the lad in the dungeon, whereupon the lad, chained in the slime, decided that yes, he might cure the princess yet. Up he came to the bedroom. She moaned and turned, and Death sat on her pillow, but occasionally closed his eyes to take a nap as he awaited her final dying. And the lad saw at these moments the moaning ceased. So the next moment Death closed his eyes, the lad snapped to the servants to turn the bed round quickly, leaving Death napping at the foot. Up sprang the lad, forced the ale into the mouth of the princess, and her life was saved. When Death woke, he grew into a rage. "Fine lad, cheating Death for kings and princesses." "I was forced to it," said the lad, rubbing his iron-bitten wrists. "That's the way of the world." "It shan't help you much," said Death. "Your time is up now, you belong to me." "What must be," said the lad. "But promise me this, you'll let me read the Lord's Prayer first." "Yes, he might have leave to do that," promised Death. But the lad, instead of sinking to his knees to pray, got up and went to tell the king his daughter was cured, and he returned home laden with gold from the grateful monarch, fully resolved to live his life without ever again reading the Lord's Prayer. And in this way he cheated Death a second time. But Death will not be cheated, not by wealth or wits. And when time had passed and the lad thought himself safe, Death snuck into the mansion where the lad now lived, and he crept up the marble staircase adorned with paintings of oil and flowers woven of silk and other deathless things. And he hung over the lad's bed a great tablet with the Lord's Prayer painted on it. And in the happy fog of the next morning's waking, the lad read, "Our Father who art in heaven, and thy kingdom come, and our daily bread." Words he recalled from his youth in a small town, whose sense he had nearly forgotten. "Deliver us from evil," he read. And finally the sense of the words rattled into his brain. but the words were read without hope, and death had him. Amen.
I had one question kind of lined up, but I think I changed it here because of your superb reading of that tale within a tale. So there's a tradition of doing that.
Yeah.
So storytelling, and you're a superb storyteller. I think it shines through in everything you do. But it's a tool in your toolkit. How do you, what do you think about that tradition of doing that?
I'm very interested in the stories that people tell and why they tell stories, right? And especially, I like to think of it in sort of two different types of stories. Stories that seem to contain their own moral, right? Where it's clear what you're supposed to think when you get to the end of the story, and I like to tell those stories to just attack them. And then there are stories where you hear them and you don't know what to do with them, or the parts don't quite fit together, or there are gaps or powerful images that speak to you but don't resolve in some way. And those, I sort of like to sit in. I think of, that Kierkegaard has these 4 or 5 retellings of the Abraham and Isaac story, and each one is quite beautiful, but it closes off more possibilities, and so I'm very interested in stories, but I'm also interested in the ways that people take these kind of elements of stories, and that particular fairy tale it's a form of a classic fairy tale, but there's some particular Norwegian twists to it, particularly that, like, I'm going to live forever by not saying the Lord's Prayer, and it's like, you Christians have the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and the French have liberté, égalité, and fraternity, and we Norwegians have godlessness, egalitarianism, and morbidity. And I find the and there's, I'm monkeying around with it quite a bit, actually, but those sorts of things, and then why somebody might want to use it in the context of negotiations over oil and economy and war just seem fertile to me.
And Oki yesterday had a personified death. You had death in your piece, Oki, didn't you? Who has a word to say? Writers, any thought about stories within stories? Randy.
Yeah, just one. What I enjoyed most about what you just did, Phil, was watching how all of us when we started to get what you were doing, we got into it with you. And what came to mind, given the nature of our conference, is the way that the liturgy gives us a structure and a logic to follow, right? And a fairy tale does that very much. And that sense that we all knew what was happening, and instead of feeling bored by it, you feel almost freed by it. And you're inside the story in a very different way because of the way that it has a deep structure that's familiar to us all. Yeah. Well done.
One more thought, panel?
I was thinking, too, something that Alice just said about seeing and seeing again. And it's interesting how the stories within the stories, they're not just cyclical, but they're layered. And I think it's really interesting how the two parts are communicating with each other and changing themselves in the process. I really liked how that worked. It was very catalytic, like how each of them was activating the other.
Great. With that, Phil, thanks very much for that. And the reading, again, was beautiful. Now we have Milwaukee's own Liam Callanan. Liam.
Hold your applause. I want to use part of my precious time to just say a massive thank you. Thank you to the organizers, the staff, but thank you to you, to not just for sitting in these chairs, but for contributing so much. It's just been a blessing for me to be here. And thank you to Anuma, who told a story yesterday about her early days in church that reminded me of a story that is kind of, I've decided is an introduction to my Catholic writing, which is I have 3 daughters. I'm blessed to have 3 beautiful, beautiful girls. And we tried them early at church, and when one of them, our middle child, who's quite the spirited child and was especially so as a youngster, about 2.5 years old, we brought her to church, and she was wrestling all the time. She just kept running and running. So I finally kind of grabbed her in my arms, and she was just squirreling and kicking. And of course, we had her in Mary Jane, so that's a very painful thing for her dad. And she said, "Put me down. I'm trying to get to God." When in Rome, my new novel is my 5th book, and I feel like it's the book that I've been trying to get to God. I feel like my work has been trying to wrestle itself out of my arms, and I've been trying to restrain it, and in this book, I just kind of let it escape. And so my daughter has done very well escaping from my arms, and I'm hoping that this book will also do well escaping from my arms as well. I'll just give you a quick synopsis. That'll take about 15 minutes, and then the reading itself will take another hour. But it's mesmerizing. The book takes place in contemporary Rome, and it's about an American woman, Claire, who's a realtor specializing in old religious properties. And she comes over to Rome to help some American nuns sell their Roman outposts, this crumbling convent. But in the process of making the sale, she decides that she loves the place so much and she loves the women so much, she starts to discern, thinks that she, in fact, may want to join the convent, believe it or not. She is, to kind of pick up on another theme of the convent, in her Dantean midlife around 50 when she comes to this decision. And her daughter and her boss, nobody thinks this is a good idea, but Claire thinks it might be. And then her old college flame shows up. I'm going to read, everyone's like, "What are you talking about?" Like, when I tell this to American bookstore audiences, they're like, "Yeah, so I can see this audience is trending a different way." Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen now. In this part of the novel, Claire comes back. She's been dispatched across town in the middle of the night or kind of late in the evening to bring a message to this man, a psychologist that the convent works with. And when she comes back, she meets Sister Georgia, who's one of the last 3 remaining nuns. She's the order's Latinist. She teaches that Latin around town. She's in her 60s. When Claire got back to the old convent in Trastevere, it was late. Sister Georgia was sitting on a stone bench in the Rosetto looking up at the night sky. "Good evening, sister," said Claire. "That took a while," Sister Georgia said. They had dispatched Claire across town to the psychologist, the one who had been supposed to interview the new postulant, Anna. But he was too old for email and wasn't answering his phone, so Claire was supposed to go and personally tell him it was off. Anna had left Rome, quit, gone. But he had confused Claire for Anna. They had talked. Claire started to say something, but Sister Georgia waved a hand. No need to explain." "Thank you," said Claire. The psychologist, Frederic, had been hard of hearing, hard at English. She wasn't exactly sure what they had talked about. Sister Georgia patted the seat beside her on the bench. "I was kidding," said Sister Georgia. "Of course you need to explain. Tell me everything." The trip home from Pineto, the sidewalk jazz, that had settled Claire, but not so much that she would tell Sister Georgia everything. Claire said, do you speak Flemish? "He's an interesting guy, isn't he? Before he was a psychologist," Sister Georgia said, "he was a missionary. He thought I was Anna," Claire said. "Oh dear," said Sister Georgia, looking more pleased than concerned. "He's losing his languages one by one with age," said Sister Georgia. "Did he try any Latin on you?" "No," Claire said. "Well, just as well," said Sister Georgia. Claire shook her head. I'm not Anna. I'm not the new postulant, or I guess the old postulant now, but for a while there, I was. I don't know Anna at all. I don't know why she came, why she left, if she's coming back, but I think I made a mess of things over there. I mean, not just literally, I spilled his wine." "You had wine?" "But we got to talking, or I did, and somehow Claire felt like she was speaking Italian or Flemish or some other language she no longer knew. She thought she had made her decision to join the order, but now it was somehow unmaking her. "This morning," Claire said, "I was ready to tell your sister Felicity, take me. The other morning I missed my daughter Dorothy so badly my heart hurt. I wanted to call my boss. It was too early. I wanted to call my friend Marcus to call me." Marcus, her old flame, who she thought she would never see again, and who had now just shown up in Rome. Sister Georgia sat back and looked at Claire a while, both hands on the bench. Then she looked away. A minute passed before she spoke. "I entered the Society of St. Gertrude with a class of 8. 8! Those were different days. Still, 2 of the women chose to leave after a week, 2 more after a month. They said they had thought it would be more fun. The remaining 4 of us felt quite proud of ourselves. We'd chosen to stay, and we lasted almost forever until Earth's closest approximation, 7 years, which is when you profess what's called final vows. But 6 months before that ceremony, the woman from the class I was closest to, Helen, came up and told me she was leaving, and she did. Claire had been content to listen, but Sister Georgia stopped as though awaiting an interruption. Claire said, "Is she still alive?" "Oh, yes," Sister Georgia said, "she's still alive. The other 2 died relatively young. May they too rest in peace. But Helen sends me cards every year, kids, grandkids, dogs, a horse. I used to throw the cards away without opening them, but I've softened." She smiled. "Does Helen visit?" Claire said. "She did once during a European grand tour, and she told me in person what she had always written, which is that I was so much stronger than her, better than her, braver than her for living this life." Sister Georgia shook her head. "It is the harder path," Claire said. She was grateful for Sister Georgia for this story, for any story to get Claire out of her head, to put her in a position where Claire might soothe Sister Georgia rather than vice versa. "Then join me on it," Sister Georgia said. "For years, people have clucked about the burdens I bear and apologized for not helping to shoulder the load. Enough!" Claire put out a hand. Sister Georgia glanced at it and turned away. "I'm just getting started." Fragments of music came over the walls, an electric dance beat bumping by in a car, a sighing accordion somewhere, a distant guitar. Sister Georgia breathed deep. "And that's the thing, isn't it? I'm not just getting started. I'm 68, 44 years a sister, good times and bad, but I've never been alone. God has been with me. My community has been with me, even as it shrinks." She looked at Claire. "We need help. The people of God need help. The church needs help in so many places, so many ways. The Convento di Santa Gertrudis, the order itself, it could all collapse tomorrow. Dear God, may it not, but we still need you and your heart that hurts." She stood. "I talked with the others. They think it's too soon, but I don't." Sister Georgia stared hard at Claire. "Too soon for what?" Claire said. "For you to start your journey with us," said Sister Georgia, "to discern for seriously now." This morning, the words would have filled and thrilled Claire. This morning, she had everything figured out until the floor fell from beneath her. Now the words settled in her chest alongside those other words, "I loved Marcus," like a stone. "I failed at finding a better buyer for you or a way to stay," Claire said. "I failed by thinking this was all about money. I failed most definitely my interview with Frederic." She took a deep breath. "And I have failed to tell you what I want." Now it was time to say it. But Sister Georgia stared the words back into her. Sister Georgia asked, "Because why have you failed to speak?" And Claire finally said the one thing she could confidently say, "I don't know." "Failure," said Sister Georgia, "is part of the process," and waited till Claire met her gaze. "So is making up your mind."
Again, I'm doing audibles on myself here, but the question I wanted to, and I now have a second question, but Liam's novels, there's such a sense of place and setting as a character. So you have Paris by the Book, you have When in Rome, The Cloud Atlas, that's a place. But I was thinking as you're reading this one, the state of religious life in the world, there are some orders of sisters, for example, that are exploding, and then other sisters are completing their work. And so this Clementine order is completing its work, and it's almost like a period of mourning before the death. Any thoughts on that, Liam? That's just how I kind of felt at this time when I heard it from you.
It's also, I feel like for them, it's also a period of hope, because they have hope. The ones who are left, most of the orders left in the United States, and they really just need to package this Roman outpost off and get it sold to add to their bottom line. But the nuns in Rome really feel like it has hope and it could live on. And I got that because I interviewed quite a few women religious for this book. And one of the things that they emphasized to me was not just the notion that there could come to, an order of service could come to completion, but that there was fired with hope and that there's still work to do. And so the women I spoke with were very adamant about that. And also were very adamant about the seriousness of a vocation. It's not just something you just toss off. Very much in the spirit of what Martin Scorsese was talking about earlier. What he said really resonated with what I had heard from the women religious. So I feel like it's actually, there's a lot of hope balanced in the novel. For some reason, there's an edition in Italian coming out, and the Italian edition is called La Chiave della Gioia, which I'm not sure if it's after our esteemed guest from Georgetown University, but it's The Key to Joy. And I thought that's a wonderful title for the book, assuming it's the same book. I'm not sure. But I feel like that's a real opportunity.
You helped me there, because it seems like, okay, the work's now just kind of transubstantiated, or there's a course correction, but God is still at work.
God's definitely at work, and one of the most interesting, and that's why I told that initial anecdote about let me get to God, because I really feel like my work has been going ever stronger in that direction. I was so fascinated that my publisher, well, like Chris, like Penguin Random House, isn't necessarily known for letting you do this, but my editor throughout the whole thing was like, let's push, let's see where we can find this rest of the story. So, I mean, the closing words of the book, "Here I am," are a direct take from Isaiah. And I felt like, are they going to let me do that? And they did. And so sometimes you just need to let go and see what comes out.
Amen. Any quick thought from the panel?
Well, I'm thinking of the Sisters of Charity, who just gave up. Heartbreaking, should be heartbreaking. I wish the church had been a little bit more vocal about it. I feel it should have been in an upheaval that shook us all in the church, that these good women decided we've done our work and we're finished, at least to give us all an opportunity to thank them and maybe to be reminded of the fabulous work they did, which I think was at Old St. Patrick's Cathedral. I don't want to correct Martin Scorsese, no way, but I don't think it was the Sisters of Mercy. I think it was the Sisters of Charity. And so even as I'm rooting for your characters, and I loved the idea of that last line from Isaiah, the reality of our church is how undervalued the contribution of women continues to be. And I promised my daughter I wouldn't say any more while it's here. Don't get yourself in trouble, Mom.
We can come back to it. Thanks, Alice. Don't get yourself in trouble, Mom.
I don't think the church has a future if it doesn't figure out how to.
So thank you very much, Liam, and great work there. So now we have Randy Boyagoda. And Randy, welcome to our panel.
I'd like to dedicate this reading to my nephews, Noah and Alex, who are traveling through Europe and found their way into the Catholic imagination by accident. They had an international incident downstairs where they were blocking Martin Scorsese's car. And they kept saying, but Uncle Randy's upstairs, and it didn't seem to work with the security people. But I'm glad to have them here with us. Because I've been here on an hourly basis, you already know what this novel is about. I've talked about my South Asian Catholic experience and how that informed this book. Talked about Dante yesterday and how it informed this book. But maybe what I wanted to do in terms of the reading for this session was talk about how creationism and creationist Christian fundamentalist theme parks were so important to my work, insofar as I visited a series of these while reading Dante every day in order to write Dante's Indiana. So what I'm going to do is read to you from a section where the main character, Prin, is visiting America's premier creationism theme park. It's called Genesis Extreme. And he's going there with his family, and he's supposed to meet the proprietor of Genesis Extreme in hopes of kind of working with them on Dante's Indiana. We drove 4 hours from Terre Haute to Kentucky along a broken-shouldered highway. Ongoing highway construction near the park, even on a Saturday, meant we had to detour onto serpentine local roads. We crawled and curled around mountains dotted with fading red and green Monopoly-like houses and drove past live-in scrapyards and shady cemeteries and red and white churches. We were slowed down by a big rig hauling frozen peas that had a sign on one back door saying, "If you don't like my driving, talk to my boss," while on the other back door there was a picture of Jesus. Eventually, we began to see Moses. Many Moseses, big fiberglass cutouts, beards blowing in the wind. They were set up at half-mile intervals along the road, pointing straight ahead to the park. Beneath the final Moses, there was a man in a lawn chair reading a scientific journal beside a homemade display of maps and charts showing the ascents of man and beast. Beside him was a cardboard cutout of a bearded Victorian, holding a sign that said, "Honk if you're evolved." We drove between the soaring legs of a giant angel holding an electrified sword and found a spot in the overnight parking lot, which was filled with camper trucks. To get to the main gates, we took a bus wrapped in the parted Red Sea, alongside other park-goers and their luggage and strollers and wheelchair strollers and coolers and oxygen tanks and traveling dialysis kits with "Roll Tide" bumper stickers. We showed our passes at the main gates and were taken by golf cart to a smaller bus, this one wrapped in bulrushes and driven by a Gulf War I vet who loaded our bags with his good hand and hummed hymns on the way to the park hotel, Rahab's Hideaway. Evangelicals love this stuff because it's full of biblical references, but a Catholic crowd seems to be missing most of them. We checked into our room. Our daughters divided the bath products, which had been made in Michigan by Iraqi Christians. The children asked if we could use the motorized scooters to go around the park. We decided to walk. Beaming, the children pulled out their girl edition park maps and began arguing for options. We could ride rafts down the Ultra Euphrates. We could visit Studio Exodus and paint lintels and doorposts with the blood of the lambs that park-goers with boy edition maps were invited to slaughter next door at the Passover test kitchen. We could join Project Take Back the Rainbow by helping stitch together the largest Technicolor Dreamcoat in the world. We could fill bags of rice for people starving in the Sudan and write letters of encouragement to the Prime Minister of Israel. We could meet Jim Caviezel. We could visit Patmos Labs. Thanks, Phil. We could visit Patmos Labs, where we could 3D print pieces of the 10 plagues of Moses, either to take home or to throw at Pharaoh during one of the thrice daily reenactments. It was all too far away by foot, and by now the motorized scooters were all checked out. And so we bought treats at Old Honey's Milk and Honey Cafe and went to the only attraction that had no lineup. The Jesse Tree Maze was laid out as a series of roots and branches off a cross-like trunk, which you could only get through by walking and knowing Jesus' genealogy. The children darted and veered around corners from begat to begat. So then they go to the hotel, and the family goes to the Palm, which is the steakhouse that's the restaurant at the hotel. And then Prin goes with some of his colleagues to the main ride at Genesis Extreme. We were taken by golf cart to David's Sling, the main attraction at Genesis Extreme. After putting on an oversized Mind the Gath t-shirt, I rode in the first of 5 smooth stone cars alongside Adam, the proprietor of Genesis Extreme. After the safety bar came down across our legs, we lurched forward and waited for the others to get into their cars. So, before we fail Goliath, tell me, what's your story in his story? I'm working for the Dante theme park that we're building in Terre Haute, and we're here, as you know, to talk about working with you and your colleagues. It's actually a two-way interview, friend. You can ask me anything you want, but I still want an answer to my question. What's your story in his story? We began accelerating. You're asking me a more personal question about my own faith commitments. All right, I'm Catholic. Way wrong. Try again. I'll say it as many times as I need to. What's your story in his story? Try again. Now we were moving really fast, straight at Goliath, and Adam was yelling in the wind. Try again. Jesus? Amen. Now say it like you RCs believe you eat it. Hang on, here we go, straight into the big dumb Gaff's head. We smashed through and dropped at a steep pace into a rumbling dark cavern and then shot out into a lower loop. We came to a stop at a sign that read, "Whose son art thou, thou young man?" And we returned to our golf carts. Okay, now just to finish, I'm going to give you Paradise as promised. So the Dante theme park itself opens, and Pern gets to go through on a little tour of it. I walked past Satan toward the tunnel that led between the parks to Paradise. The elevators were set into a wall painted to look like a starry galaxy. Inside one was a smiling young woman in a ruby red velvet gown, one of the Beatrices. Trumpets and French horns filled the air. Glowing constellations and laser lights beamed onto the floors and walls and ceilings. Long, stone-framed glass slabs were set up at intervals along the concourse, onto which were projected holographs of saved souls reading cantos from Dante and verses from the Bible. At opposite ends of the arena, just above the floor, were choir lofts full of white-gowned singers with combed-out hair. They were practicing a collective duet, call and response, back and forth, human voices in harmony, washing and warping. I passed a carousel playing tinny celestial organ box music, its horses transformed into heavenly creatures, griffins, lions, eagles, and rams. Beside it was a kiddie ride, individual spaceships zooming around a track inside a bandshell painted as the solar system, held in the massive palms of God. A corner of the arena had a bumper car pen, each car done up as a winged and laughing baby face. Every now and then I heard the shuddering and slamming of a roller coaster as it descended next door in hell. Eventually, we went to the Ferris wheel, which had been painted to look like a shining circle of sunbeams. After we were seated, we went up to the massive Imperium rose that had been installed in place of the four-sided scoreboard. Its glowing folds swayed slowly, blowing warm, scented air at us. I looked down. How high up before our lives look so fitted together? Young men in cropped angel wings dropping into bungee cord dives and pulling up their body-socked partners. Cloud-painted ski lift cars sailing through the middle air, massage chair thrones, their buffed rotating pads catching light. Gymnasts in white feathers and brown bodysuits building themselves into a giant eagle and then laughing as they flapped the wings and took flight, leaping and tumbling to the floor. The sound of the choirs, a distant spread of crashing joy. Thank you.
I hear a sound in the room. It's the sound of our first Chesterton Daily Double. Randy, you get a line from GKC. Here it comes. Funny is not the opposite of serious. Funny is the opposite of not funny.
Was that a criticism? Did I bomb?
No.
Is that what I just...
I just want you to comment on humor in general, humor in theology, humor in the Catholic novel, humor in your own work.
Well, this goes back actually to the Flannery O'Connor panel. This is one of the beauties of having this time together and chatting like this. And we were talking about this at the coffee break. Marilyn Robinson is not funny, right? Like, beautiful writer, I joined the club, I review her, I love her, I teach her, but she's not funny. And it seems to me that you'd be hard-pressed to think of a great line of funny Protestant novelists, right? Like the thought doesn't really make sense, but there seems to be something inherently comic to a Catholic vision, and it's something that I'm I think very naturally drawn to, and I think that's where I am right now, I guess you could say, as a writer, as I can't help but see the humor in it. I think ultimately, if I had to put it in more serious terms, it's because ultimately I think we believe that the world is not a tragedy. What is a tragedy? A tragedy is a comedy with a tragic ending. What is comedy? It's a tragic story with a happy ending, right? If you think about it.
I love that, and you think about humor. On the one hand, you have somebody like Milan Kundera says, all humor is sacrilege, right? But to give you a Protestant, Auden thought that a religious commitment entailed a commitment to humor. Because if you're a Christian, you have to think that be perfect is seriously addressed to you, which makes you an absurd figure.
Yeah.
And that, to borrow from Ted Cohen, one way of seeing that which is absurd and you can't comprehend is, one expression is awe, and another one is delighted laughter. And so I wondered if you could talk about, because in that, it seemed that the honk, if you love evolution, was actually a really critical piece of the humor, so that it's funny and enjoying the absurdity, but it doesn't seem tinged with contempt.
Well, thank you. I think I'm trying to perhaps be Catholic small c in terms of satire, right? If you're only going after one group, that seems to me, very much a contemptuous approach. Mm-hmm. Actually, as you were describing what you were describing, Phil, maybe I'll just end by remembering this in the context of what you said and then also what Mike was bringing up. You'll all remember the suicide bombings on Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka a few years ago. And shortly after that, we went to a Sri Lankan Catholic memorial mass in Toronto at a Sri Lankan parish. And we were all there, and there was an older lady sitting in front of us, and then she saw, my wife and I were there with our 4 daughters. And she gave each of them a chocolate, okay, in the middle of Mass. And our daughters are trying their best to be very solemn and serious. And it was hot and it was packed. and the chocolate began melting in their hands. And so they sat there with great dignity like this, with chocolate melting everywhere. And here we are commemorating, it was an Easter Sunday bombing at a First Communion, let's remember, right? And so it's incredibly intense and serious, but that's what I saw, And other writers would see something else, but I couldn't help but see, because that's where I found humanness, was these children with chocolate dripping down their hands, trying to be solemn in this serious occasion, and it's bringing those two things together is what I like to do with my writing.
There is the famous thing, it's actually Father John Jenkins from Notre Dame, and he says the Catholic imagination is holding two opposite things up together and proceeding as if they're not opposite. And I think that kind of gets to that. One more quick thought on humor. I know we all like to laugh up here. Liam, you were going to say something, weren't you?
I was going to just ask about the writing act, because you tilted some. I mean, it's a beautiful book and it's really funny, but it's also after some really serious quarry. And how did you keep it? But I felt like a little bit like Phil was saying, it felt like it was fun for you. How did you keep it fun, the writing, even as you were wrestling with really difficult issues?
Like many people here, I'm an academic and I'm a novelist, a creative writer, let's say. And the first version of this was terrible because it was responsible. It was like Dante by numbers. I had everything very structured, and I was writing like a professor in a sense, right? And that's a terrible way to write fiction. And at some point, that kind of broke away, and I realized that I wasn't trying to write some sort of homage to Dante, but in fact, I was kind of liberated by being in the Dante comic universe in a sense, and just moving around and telling my own story. And then that's when I began to enjoy it a lot more, I think.
Thank you, one and all. Our anchor man, or our person running anchor, is Christopher Beha. So, Chris, please welcome. You going to sit, or you want to come over here?
I'm going to stay here.
Okay.
If the table read is good enough for Alice McDermott, then it is good enough for me.
I thought because I was the short one.
No, it's, there's such a thing as tough acts to follow, but the Pope, and then Flannery O'Connor, and then Martin Scorsese, and then these three that's tough. So I'm going to be quick, is what I'll do. I'll be short.
I had the same question.
He's more. No, I didn't mean Randy. I mean everyone but Randy. So anyway,
Dead to me.
I am going to be fairly short here, I hope. But I'm just going to read from the first couple of pages of my last novel, which is called The Index of Self-Destructive Acts. But I wanted to do an unusual thing first, which is to read the epigraph of the novel, which is this. I agree that 2 times 2 is 4 is an excellent thing, but if we're going to start praising everything, then 2 times 2 is 5 is sometimes also a most charming little thing, which most of you will now know as Dostoevsky Notes from Underground. Mm-hmm. So yesterday we found out that this is a favorite quote of Pope Francis, which I was very moved to hear. I will say about this, what I'm about to read, that it's actually set on the Bowery, but a very different Bowery than the one that Scorsese grew up around. The novel is set roughly in the New York media world, and most of the time that I'm reading from it, I'm reading from it to people who are in the New York media world. And that is one of those very small worlds that think it is the entire world. And it's been so gratifying the last couple of days to be getting this international perspective and to be sharing these stories with so many people from different parts of the world. So I'm not going to try and explain anything here in terms of background, but if it seems a bit foreign to some people, then I think all the better. I think it's probably good for me sometimes to be reading this kind of material and understanding that it is foreign to some people. And that's it for setup. What makes a life, Sam Waxworth sometimes wondered, self or circumstance? On the day that Waxworth arrived in New York to write for The Interviewer, a man named Herman Nash stood on the rim of the fountain in Washington Square and announced that the world was about to end. After close biblical reading and careful calculation, Nash had settled on November 1st at 10 p.m. as the precise moment of the event he called the Great Unveiling. So far as Waxworth knew, no time zone had been specified. Perhaps it would be an incremental apocalypse. A tourist captured the prediction on video, and more than 50,000 people watched it on T's View that week. Nash appeared at the same time the following Saturday and the one after that, by which point his audience had grown so large that it brought out the police. When he called on his listeners to prepare for a coming battle, at least one took the words literally, throwing a bottle of urine at a mounted officer who lost control of his horse, which ran him out of the park and several blocks up Fifth Avenue. All of this was in turn recorded and posted and viewed. Soon it seemed that Armageddon was everywhere. Waxworth wasn't one to find intimations of catastrophe in the pages of a 3,000-year-old assemblage of myth and poetry and legal documents. Waxworth was a philosopher. Not by training or by occupation, but, he believed, by disposition. He tried to attend to the facticity of things. The world in Waxworth's view was a knowable place once you stripped away the dead tradition and wishful thinking built up over millennia of misunderstanding. For most of human history, and even today in places, such an effort could condemn you to death. Conditions were better in Waxworth's particular moment and milieu, but absolute honesty still required a certain amount of courage. In lieu of rack and ropes, the modern skeptic faced social suspicion and familial disappointment. Faced too his own admitted desire that life should carry more meaning than the facts could bear. Which facts were these? We occupied a tiny corner of the universe, minor planet orbiting a minor star, in an even tinier corner of cosmological time. Still, we wanted all of it, the sun and the moon and the firmament that held them, to be about us. This want had been bred into humanity, selected by nature, so it must have served some purpose once, but it had long outlived its usefulness as far as Waxworth was concerned. What was needed now was to know. For all that, he felt an odd admiration for Herman Nash, who'd made a prediction that could be tested against the world, and in so doing put himself at risk of being wrong. When you stuck to interpreting the past, you could say anything. The sheer amount of available information meant that data could be arranged to support every conceivable idea. The test of knowledge was what it told you about tomorrow. Easy enough to laugh at Herman Nash, but the very things that made his prediction so inviting to mock, its combination of specificity and unlikelihood, were exactly what impressed Waxworth. He's probably a lunatic, he admitted to his editor over dinner during his second week in town, but that's better than being a con artist. There's something inspiring about it when you put it that way, his editor replied. They were eating at Temps Perdu, a neo-bistro on the Bowery. The host had seated them at a red leather banquette near the back of the room. A large mirror hung over the editor's head, and Waxworth saw himself in it, framed by distressed brick and pressed tin. In front of Waxworth waited a foie gras terrine with rhubarb compote. French yeye pop played softly from speakers above. They were nearly through their first bottle of red, and the editor, whose name was Max Blakeman, was attempting to order a second. It was the spring of 2009, the global economy was in a state of collapse, and Waxworth understood the magazine industry to be more completely collapsed than most, but Mario Adrian, Teaser co-founder, social media billionaire, had lately purchased The Interviewer, rendering the publication more or less immune from cyclical pressure. So Blakeman had explained when convincing Waxworth to move halfway across the country to write for him. It really gets to the heart of my philosophy, Waxworth said. You have your own philosophy. Blakeman gave a not-quite smile. I've always wanted one of those, but they seem like so much work to maintain. I believe in getting things wrong. Blakeman smiled in full, almost indulged a laugh. I wish you told me that before I hired you. I thought you were the guy who got everything right. Waxworth was slightly uncomfortable with his recently minted reputation as a seer. He'd been working as a software engineer in Madison the previous fall when his political projection system had correctly predicted the exact count of the Electoral College, the outcome of every Senate, House, and gubernatorial race. Naturally, he'd been pleased with the attention that had followed this feat, but there was nothing mystical in what he'd done. Quite the opposite. The numbers had been there all along for anyone who cared to look. Of course, I don't want to be wrong all the time, but it's bound to happen eventually. In the long run, everyone regresses to the mean. There's a philosophy, Blakeman said. In the long run, everyone regresses to the mean. The point is, beliefs should be tested against the world. That's the scientific method. You don't just try to convince people with arguments. You don't put reality to a vote. You set up an experiment, you predict how it will come out. If you're wrong, you modify your theory and you start over. So this guy should be embraced for giving his ravings some rigor. If anything, more people should do it. Blakeman leaned back in appreciation. Why all religious people should be like Herman Nash. He looked up as though the headline floated in the air between them. It sounds very shareable. After a pause, he clarified, that's a good thing. Mario is big on shareability. He said the word with cheerful disgust before raising his hand, waving away further thought of the man who was paying for their meal, and gesturing again to the waiter for the next bottle. So we'll start with the end of the world, he said, and we'll see where things go from there.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks very much. So we have the world of teaser. We all know what that is. But again, I think I'm just letting the spirit guide this. Alice had a word that makes the most sense to me anyway in a theological framework, inconsolable. There's something profound about that experience. And then in your work, Chris, I'm not giving anything away, but there's a character, Frank Doyle, another theologically charged word. He makes a major public trespass. And so we talked about this kind of like, the parts of us that are fallible and dark and ugly. And the character, it's a baseball game at Shea Stadium, and there's Tim McCarver and Joe Buck, and the fictional Frank Doyle steps in it in a big way. We spoke last night at dinner about public confession and navigating kind of the prickly parts of yourself and worse in a public space. And I think you're doing some of that in your novel. That's, this is half form, but can you help me out and pick me up there?
Sure. Frank gets what we would now call canceled. But the novel, I started writing it 10 years ago, and it's about events. It takes place about 5 years before then, and it's not meant to be a commentary on this element of the culture right now. But it is, I think, there are elements of it that are about forgiveness and redemption. But I don't, Frank is not set up as simply a victim of a punitive culture, He says, what he does is he makes a racist joke. Certain people in some press outlets have described it as he misspeaks or something like that. It's a racist joke that is, he's drunk when he does it, but it's motivated by animus. So I'm not trying to, within this kind of literary culture, political literary culture, it was dominated for a very, very, very long time by people like Frank, who had the kinds of assumptions that he did and could act on them with impunity. So part of the reckoning that he's dealing with is, I think, an appropriate reckoning. It's not a sort of anti-cancel culture.
Because it is amazing, because you wrote this is 10 years, right?
Yeah.
And how things have changed. Now you work in a hyperactive media culture where we have people like Nick Kroll and John Mulaney making a kind of cottage industry out of, like, forgive me in public. That's so different than this setting.
Well, if I can just jump on what you're saying to make a slightly different point. Yeah. But one of the things, I think, in the American context right now that I don't know if it's happening globally, certainly with Anglo-American literature and with the obsession with what we call autofiction, right? That is profoundly in question, I think, is whether it even makes sense to tell stories about people other than yourself. Essentially, whether it makes sense to do something other than use literature as an expression of subjectivity. And where I think I will, maybe be the last person for this weekend to use this term Catholic imagination that we've heard so many times comes into this, is this sense of, part of the question is whether or not actual meaning resides in the events of the world, or whether or not meaning only resides in human minds, whether meaning is something that we impose on a fundamentally chaotic and disordered reality, or whether meaning is something that we try to discern that exists within the reality. And so I think that the fact that so much of American literary culture is about, whether it's confessional or not, is about subjectivity and is about individual expression, and it does get into these questions of authenticity and appropriation and what stories you're allowed to tell. But I think on a much more fundamental level, I think there's people who doubt that telling a story about an imagined set of characters living in a more or less realistic frame and having events happen to them, that could even be meaningful. Because if you believe that the world we're in is created, and that it is created with intention, then it's not such a leap to say that we can create worlds ourselves that then can have meaning in them. But I think there's a lot of people who have given up on that belief, who think of reality as fundamentally meaningless, think that through a kind of the luck of the draw of evolution, our cognitive powers at a certain point got complicated enough that this epiphenomenon of consciousness happened. Yeah. And then that brought meaning into the world. Yeah. The world was not created with intention. Our ability to have thoughts about the world is where meaning comes from. And so as a writer, if you want to have meaning in your work, it has to be about your conscious experience, personal, subjective experience of reality, rather than about looking to go back to how Alice started this, just looking really carefully at things and trying to discern what the meaning is.
In about a minute, Phil, but please do.
So, and then the other side of that is where there's no meaning. I will just say that I love that right before reading that Dostoevsky quote, you added 2 novelists on your left and 2 novelists on your right and came up with 3. So you have a much darker imagination than Dostoevsky. But one thing that I love, I think as religious writers, there's this division we like to make, the calculable scientific worldview and then the religious one. And I think that is a real tension, but one of the things you do is there's a connection between your main character and this religious figure. They actually think in similar terms. And I think that there's absolutely that tradition within Catholicism, the sorts of folks who maybe really love Thomas Aquinas, but not that part where he has the vision at the end and says everything that he saw is like straw. And I wondered if you could talk about the way in which that style of thinking, which is less about mystery than answers, creeps into religious imagination as well.
Sure. Well, one thing I'd say is this Sam Waxworth character, who those of you who do know the U.S. political and media world might recognize he has some similarities with Nate Silver, but he is of a type that is very much a recognizable type in the U.S., which is the person who has made a religion, by which I simply mean a comprehensive worldview, out of scientific materialism. And so they are trying to make every choice in their lives through that. And this was all 15 years ago, but if it were today, Sam Waxworth would be an effective altruist, but it would be the idea that all of our choices can be rationalized in this way, and that life is ultimately a problem to be solved, and to be solved through rational management, And I think there are obviously people for whom religion does serve that function, There's a set of rules, and you follow the rules. There's a set of behaviors, there's a set of rituals, you check off all the boxes, and in that way, it is like a kind of algorithm, and then you don't have to worry about the interior state of your heart. But that's, of course, not what Catholicism teaches us at all.
Thanks very much. I want to hear one from the crowd, just so we have some dialogue. Then Mark's going to move us on to Mass. So one thought from the audience, comment. I see you, Angela. Please. We have a hard stop at 5 o'clock. Yeah. Hard stop right now, Angela. We're gonna have to. And we're going to have to kind of table that. Yeah, so, Angela, yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, well,
So, but first of all, I want to thank this panel for doing such an extraordinary job after Pope Francis and after Martin Scorsese, but bringing back our hearts and our minds to what we're all about. So it was just wonderful to hear if you haven't read their novels, you have to. Truly a community of writers that we all want to follow. Let's give them a round of applause. And